Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a esta quinta sesión del ciclo de bilingüismo del Instituto Cervantes de Manchester y de Leeds. Soy Julio Villagarcía, profesor titular de la Universidad de Manchester, y bienvenidos todos y todas. Les agradecería que, si tienen el micrófono activado, lo desactivaran durante la charla. Después tendremos preguntas. The talk will take place in English, so I may as well switch to English now. Welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Julio Villagarcía, a senior lecturer in Spanish linguistics and syntax at the University of Manchester, and it's an honor to present the fifth session, the fifth talk of the bilingualism series of this year 2021. So far, we've attended talks by Kim Potowski, for instance, talking about the benefits of being multilingual and how monolingualism can be cured. We also had a talk by a former professor of the University of Manchester, Yaron Matras, on bilingualism, code switching, and the advantages that bilingualism brings to individuals and to society. We also had a very nice talk by Antonella Sorace, professor at the University of Edinburgh and founder of the Bilingualism Matters enterprise. And finally, we had a talk by Kai González Bilbazo on code switching and a number of aspects about bilingualism. And today is the fifth talk on the advantages of bilingualism for autism. It's really a great honor to introduce Adam Feinstein, okay, like Einstein, Feinstein, who will be delivering the lecture, The Advantages of Bilingualism in Autism. As I said, this is the fifth talk of the bilingualism series, and it's a real pleasure to have you all here. By now, we are all familiar with the multiple benefits that bilingualism brings to individuals and to society on different levels. But in reality, little is known about the gains that bilingualism and multilingualism more generally brings about in relation to the development of children with autism. And this is a gap that tonight's talk aims to fill. Adam Feinstein is an acclaimed non-fiction writer, journalist, translator, language expert, and Hispanist. He's well known for having produced translations of Neruda, Lorca, Benedetti, among many others. Feinstein is extremely versatile, I would say an all-rounder, and actually also works in the field of autism. So Adam Feinstein is the author of the very well acclaimed, very well received book, A History of Autism, Conversations with the Pioneers, published by Blackwell in 2010. And in fact, towards the end of the last century, he founded an international autism magazine named Looking Up. So we are here obviously to listen to Adam Feinstein. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming him. Many thanks, Adam, and many thanks to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julio, for those kind words. Yes, Einstein with an F in front. That's what I always say. That's the way to do it. That's the easiest. Well, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here and to be collaborating once again with the Instituto of Manchester and Leeds. I worked with them last year on launching my translations of Rubén Darío, and that was a great joy. And I'm a great admirer of the Instituto of Cervantes around the world, so it's always a pleasure to join forces with them. So I'm going to talk about the advantages of bilingualism and autism, as Julio said. And yeah, I think probably somebody needs to mute their microphone, please. Yeah, otherwise we'll get dogs and cats and pets barking in the background, which does happen sometimes. So first of all, I'm just going to share my screen, of course, which would help. What is bilingualism? Just to define the terms. Put simply, bilingualism is the ability to use two languages however, to use two languages or dual languages. However, defining bilingualism is problematic since individuals with varying bilingual characteristics may be classified as bilingual. So it can range from a minimal proficiency in two languages to an advanced level of proficiency, which allows the speaker to function and appear as a native-like speaker of two languages. And a person may describe himself or herself as bilingual, but that may mean only the ability to converse and communicate orally. They may not be able to read, for instance. Others may be proficient in reading in two or more languages or biliterate. A person may be bilingual by virtue of having grown up learning and using two languages simultaneously. That's known as simultaneous bilingualism, or they may become bilingual. They may become bilingual by learning a second language sometime after their first language. And that's known as sequential bilingualism. So to be, obviously, as you can see, to be bilingual means different things to different people. In this presentation, I'm going to focus almost entirely on a specific and still highly neglected area, namely bilingualism in individuals with autism. And here, let me make another clarification about acquisition of a second language. I'm not, except for a few tangential sort of diversions, I'm not going to analyze bilingualism in those intellectually extremely able individuals on the autism spectrum who are interested in foreign languages and are able to learn one or more of these. People like this man, Daniel Tammet. I don't know whether you know this name. He's a remarkable guy. He has Asperger's syndrome, which is on the so-called higher functioning end of the spectrum. Asperger's syndrome, by the way, is not mild autism, as it's so often referred to. Asperger's syndrome can be very, very serious. They have the same, people with Asperger's have the same issues with changes of routine as anybody else on the autism spectrum. So Daniel has Asperger's. He also has synesthesia. Synesthesia means you mix up your senses. So his book, one of his well-known books was called Born on a Blue Day, because he was born on Wednesday and Wednesday is always blue. He's also a remarkable mathematician. He knows pi to 25,000 places. I have no idea why, but he does. And more importantly for this talk, he is a very talented linguist. He speaks 10 languages, and he learned one of the most difficult languages in the world, Icelandic, in just a week, sufficiently well to be able to be interviewed on Icelandic television in 1 week. And he told me when I interviewed him in the Observer in 2012, my love of languages is inspired by the fact that although organic, they are rules-based, and people with Asperger's syndrome enjoy rules. But the rules can be bent and played with, like mathematics. Languages are a great source of creativity. So bilingualism is widespread throughout the world. Speaking 2 or more languages is the norm for nearly 2/3 of the world's population. So in Canada, for example, you have both English and French are national languages, and there's been a growth in its migrant population. As a result, you have nearly 6.6 million people there who speak a language which is other than English or French at home. And you find similar trends in other Western countries. For example, from the 2008-2012 American Community Survey, they estimated that 20.5% of people in the US use a language other than English at home. And then in 2013, in New Zealand, they reported that Hindi as the 4th most spoken language. That's tripled that figure since 2001. As you can see, 19% of Europeans are bilingual, 25% are trilingual, and 10% speak 4 or more languages. However, data on ethnicity and autism at times have been conflicting, with some literature suggesting there's no difference in prevalence of ASD. When I say ASD, that's short for autism spectrum disorders. across ethnicities, while other studies suggest an increased prevalence of ASD in immigrant families compared to non-immigrant families. Now, the situation in the UK is in England, at least 1 in 5 pupils has English as an additional language, and this number is steadily rising. Despite this, a recent interview study with a number of educators based here in the UK supporting bilingual children with autism showed that although educators hold positive views about bilingualism, opinions vary greatly when it comes to autistic pupils. Many of these educators reported not recommending bilingualism for all autistic children. And this was predominantly based on that child's language abilities and autism profile. So those UK that 2020 in a study earlier this year, very recent study, they expressed the belief that children with high functioning autism, and I caution against using that term, as I said, because autism, Asperger's, although it is high functioning autism intellectually, is also very low functioning in terms of accepting change of routine. And some people like my son, who is non-verbal autistic, have very they have talents in certain fields. So they're high functioning some and low functioning others, but I'm using high functioning autism as a shortcut. Anyway, the UK educators believe that children with high functioning autism could choose the language they wanted to speak, but that for most autistic children, bilingualism is not helpful in their phrase, with potential confusion emerging as a major concern. We'll come back to that, but basically the idea is if they're already having trouble with their main language or their one language, the idea, hypothesis, and it has been so for many decades, has been that children with autism should not be taught a second language because this will confuse them in learning their first main language. As I'll show in a minute, there's no evidence whatsoever to support that view, and yet it has been the dominant, prevalent view that the professionals in the field have held, and it's the main advice that has been passed on to parents. Hoping that by the end of this talk, you'll see why that's completely erroneous, or should be seen as erroneous. Educators reported difficulty in effectively assessing and identifying the needs of autistic bilingual pupils. In special education, data regarding teachers' attitudes to bilingualism but autistic pupils are scarce, but no evidence suggests that pupils with limited expressive language would not be able to understand words from different languages. What's the legal situation worldwide? Well, all children should have access to language learning and the opportunities that come with it as a fundamental human right. But this is currently not the case for all autistic children. Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from 2006, which highlights the rights of persons with disabilities, highlights the rights for children, all children, not just people with disabilities, includes respect for the rights of children with disabilities to preserve their identities and recognizing specific cultural and linguistic identity, although it could in some instances be reasonable to violate this right if evidence showed that bilingualism could harm a normal, in quotes, development. No research to date has found long-term negative effects of bilingualism. Of course, that's the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so it's talking about children with disabilities, just to correct what I said earlier. So, as I said, the advice generally given to parents of autistic children is and has been, in my view, erroneous, completely wrong. Among the general public, as well as among clinicians, it's generally accepted that bilingualism is beneficial to typically developing children's social, linguistic, and cognitive development. But when you're talking about children with language disorders, like autism, or specific language impairment, or a few other conditions, widespread concerns still remains for the effects of learning two languages for these children. So what about bilingualism in autistic children? Until very recently, and very recently, and it's still going on today, amongst some in some parts of the world, and I would say even here in the UK, until very recently, the advice of most professionals worldwide has been to limit language acquisition and expression to one language as far as possible. And the thinking behind this advice is that the language regression or delay seen in many individuals with autism spectrum disorder arouses concerns that by adding another language system with additional vocabulary, a different grammatical structure, variation in phonology, etc., then that will or may further delay the development of the child's language. And parents are also worried about causing their child additional confusion when they're already obviously struggling in many cases with language development. However, as I'll show in this presentation, there's no convincing evidence whatsoever to support the claims that learning a second language will be detrimental to an autistic child's development. Quite the contrary. A number of recent studies have demonstrated improvement in behavior, increased cognitive skills, and most recently, improved executive function in these children. Executive function means planning of time. It means clock watching. It means being able to do more than one activity or to switch activities quickly and easily, which all these things are a problem in many children with autism, called executive function, or EF for short. But despite the lack of evidence-based research, professionals often continue to encourage caregivers to use, or parents to use, and they are caregivers of course, to use only one language with the child, even if the rest of the family is bilingual. So let's be fair, and let's try and at least examine or analyze the potential, the possible disadvantages of a dual language environment for children on the autism spectrum. Well, Dobke in 2006 reflected on the potential difficulties that a dual language environment could cause a child with autism, and stressed the importance of considering the child's sensory abilities and his or her ability to generalize. Dobke discussed how an autistic child's sensory perception was usually atypical. It is. And luckily, the DSM-5, the American Psychiatric Association's latest manual, diagnostic manual, published in 2013, for the first time included sensory, atypical sensory issues as part of the definition of autism. We who work in autism, we were very glad because it's the first time that it's been included in the official diagnosis definition of autism, even though people have been working in the field from the 1940s, from 1949, writing papers about sensory differences in autism. So Dobke pointed to those sensory differences. Now, they're differences because sometimes they're heightened and sometimes they're dulled. For instance, my son Johnny, autistic, severely autistic, cannot speak. He has very little, he has hyposensitivity for cold objects. So he used to hold an ice lolly by the lolly end rather than the stick. He used to prefer to do that. And somehow he didn't seem to feel the cold. That's an example of hypo. And of course, there are many people with autism are sensitive to noise or to light, or fluorescent lighting, which is why a lot of people who find work in an office with people with autism request that the lighting is replaced or turned down. And these accommodations or adjustments are actually part of the Autism Act and the Equality Act, 2009, 2010, respectively, which lay down that the employers have to bring in these adjustments if they're required. So the sensory issues do exist, and Dobke was right to refer to those. Our senses allow us to learn about the world through how we feel and what we see, smell, hear, and taste. And if a person's senses are atypical, Dr. argues, that person will perceive the world around them differently from the way a typical person would, resulting in a difference and a potential insufficiency of cognitive development. He's right on that. And the critics of bilingualism for autistic children also raise the notion of generalization, the ability to learn something in one context and apply it to another, from explicit learning to general application. Individuals with autism tend to struggle to take what they learn explicitly in one context and then apply it to another. For example, a child may learn how to eat properly and behave at the dinner table at home, but if they go to a friend's house, those same mannerisms may not carry over, and they need to be explicitly shown again what is appropriate behavior. The ability to generalize, of course, is also important in language development for the purpose of applying language use in different contexts and using different structures. That's known as pragmatics. And a great number of autistic people have problems with pragmatics, knowing how to use language in a specific context. So as a result, it's been generally, but I believe wrongly, assumed that adding an additional language would just add to the confusion which the individual with ASD, with autism, experiences, and this should therefore be avoided. Now, what are the advantages of a dual language environment for children on the autism spectrum? Among the many of them, many advantages, and I'll show some of them. It's a valuable tool. Bilingualism in general is a valuable tool, but in autism, it's cultural, social, and lived experiences for autistic and non-autistic people alike. Research consistently finds no negative effects of bilingualism. Now, I'll quote some studies in a minute, which highlight certain improvements that are made in autistic behavior and autistic cognitive skills with bilingualism, and highlights the potential for positive effects across cognitive and social cultural domains for autistic and non-autistic children. Yet, parents of autistic children remain concerned that bilingualism will cause delays in both cognitive and language development, and are still frequently advised by practitioners to raise their child monolingually. Evidently, findings from research are not reflected in practice or subsequent advice, and it is essential to identify ways to ensure equal access to additional language learning. Because the idea that bilingualism is damaging, as I say, for language learning in children with autism, while widespread, is not supported by the few studies conducted so far. Research has found no differences in vocabulary, communication skills, and age of early language milestones when comparing children with autism exposed to either one or two languages. There's also evidence that children with autism can manage vocabulary in more than one language. It's even possible that some of the ways that bilingualism helps typical children could also apply in autism. Bilingual children without autism tend to do better than monolinguals in some social and communication skills, as well as flexible thinking. And in fact, one study showed that bilingual autistic children use more gestures to communicate than those exposed to one language. Bilingualism may also contribute to emotional well-being and identity for children with autism. For many parents in one study from the University of Edinburgh, speaking a minority language, in other words, not English, was associated with expressions of affection, with communication with the extended family, and links to cultural identity. Especially, and this is a quote from one parent, especially when he wants to express his fondness to me, he deliberately chooses Russian words. And another quote from a parent, the native languages are much closer to home, family, community. So that's very important that I'm speaking to him. It's very important that I'm speaking to him in that language because I feel much closer to him. We'll come back to that point later. In addition, some parents told the Edinburgh researchers that speaking only English with their child could be restricting, as they did not want to pass on grammatical mistakes. So another quote from a parent: sometimes I would like to say something to her, and sometimes I stop because I'm worried to say things incorrectly, so that she learns things incorrectly. Exposure to the home language of their parents then might mean a high quality emotional, linguistic input for children on the autism spectrum. And of course, one more important advantage, as you see on this slide, in bilingual societies like Quebec, is that speaking two languages is actually a requisite for obtaining a job. With only around 15% of people on the autism spectrum finding their way into workplace, 15, 16 in the UK, this is a key consideration. My latest book, Autism Works, my latest book on autism anyway, was called Autism Works. And that was all about finding employment right across the spectrum. So come back to that slide in a minute, because I want to talk about parental concerns. Despite an absence of negative effects of bilingualism, many parents remain concerned, as I said, about the potentially harmful effects of bilingualism. And they're also frequently advised by clinicians to bring up their children monolingually, their autistic children monolingually. And of course, this causes great anxieties in parents' autistic children who are already laden down with many others, with the responsibility of caring for an autistic child in the first place. Maybe they have misplaced, erroneous guilt. Absolutely wrong to feel guilt. For instance, for the MMR, which is there was no evidence that the MMR causes autism. The bad old refrigerator mother theory has been disproved millions of times, and yet some parts of the world it still attains this horrible theory, that dangerous, damaging theory that a parent can cause his or her child's autism, which is completely inaccurate and completely wrong and very, very damaging. But there are concerns that the bilingual children often have reduced vocabulary in each of their languages, even though their overall vocabulary across languages is comparable to that of their monolingual peers. And admittedly, a more restricted vocabulary in the majority language would impact the child's access to clinical support, as in the Bialystok paper in 2010. However, research also indicates that exposure to multiple languages from early childhood is beneficial for language development, and with some linguistic skills transferring across languages. Other parental concerns, there are specific concerns can arise in predominantly monolingual countries with parents who have a different native language. For example, immigrant families, but they choose to use the majority language at home. So unlike fluent speakers, non-fluent speakers of the majority language have reported problems and discomfort when they try to communicate with their child, and they're anxious about teaching them the wrong way to speak the language, and that can lead to reduced communication with their child. One US-based study with immigrant parents of autistic children who used only English at home showed a decline in parent-child interactions and in the child's participation in family conversations. And given the association between one's native language and emotional processing, parents may feel more able to connect emotionally with their child in their native language, and choosing to speak a non-native language may undermine the emotional value of parent-child communication. Indeed, parents report feeling less restricted and closer to their autistic child when using their native language. This makes sense, really. And choosing monolingualism can also have negative consequences on their child's feeling of identity, inclusion, and access to cultural heritage. And an important fact, the last point on this slide, is that the decision to stop using the home language is often motivated by the fact that the services a child might need, an autistic child might need, would be provided only in the majority language. And as such, parents are faced with a dilemma, a really awful dilemma, which is they have to choose between access to services and the use of their native language with their child. I think this dilemma is often impossible to resolve, and they shouldn't be put in that position. Just a word about social stigma, because research findings suggested a lack of understanding of autism within some communities. And of course, we're improving a lot due to the fact that autism is written about and is depicted on more and more films, written about in the media. We have a UN Autism Day, Universal Autism Day around the world on April the 2nd every year. Autism was the first disability to be given its own day by the United Nations. So April the 2nd every year, there's a lot of awareness, increased awareness. But in spite of that, there are still misunderstandings and erroneous stereotypes about autism. And these could be compounded with a social stigma reported by cultural minorities here in the UK and elsewhere in the world. In particular, experiences of increased stigma when accessing healthcare and stigma around autism within their own and the wider community could ultimately lead to increased social exclusion and misunderstanding, which is the last thing, as you can imagine, a person with autism needs. Absolutely the last thing when they're already, sometimes already excluded from school. Some people with autism because the teacher feels unable to cope with a particular specific behavior, or they feel anyway excluded from society because they feel different. So it's the last thing they need is more social exclusion. So here's a study from 2012 by Hambley and Fombun. And 2012, they compared the social and language abilities of 75 young preschool children with autism, who were categorized into 3 groups, using various tools to measure their abilities. And they found that bilingually exposed children with autism did not show additional delays in areas of social responsiveness, initiating of pointing, response to pointing, attention to voice, total conceptual vocabulary, words in dominant and second languages, age of first words, and age of first phrases. They did not find, these autistic children, additional delays in these areas compared to monolingually exposed subjects. That's quite a convincing finding in my view. And they also did not find a significant difference in these skills, these skills between bilingual children who grew up in simultaneous versus sequential bilingual environments. Remember, that means simultaneous, you learn 2 languages at the same time, versus one language learned at one stage and another one acquired later in life. Approximately 60% of the bilingually exposed children were observed to be acquiring vocabulary in 2 languages. And so the authors concluded that given these findings, caregivers should not be discouraged from continuing to speak to their children bilingually, nor introducing a second language. Just as a personal aside, one of the co-authors of this paper, Eric Fombun, diagnosed my son unofficially on a plane. I was on a plane going to a conference, and this very distinguished man sat down, and beside me, in the seat beside me on the plane, and we started speaking, and I started talking about Johnny, and I said, we're a bit concerned because he stopped speaking at the play group, and he stopped playing with his friends he used to play with, and he's sitting on his own, playing with the wheels of a car, not joining in the wheels on the bus song. And he very quickly said to me, oh, he has autism, I guarantee it. And now I'm a journalist, so I'm professionally trained to be skeptical. And I said, what does this stranger know? He hasn't met Johnny. And also, I haven't got a clue what autism was. I didn't have any idea. And my son, when I was talking 1996 on this plane, heading for somewhere the other side of the world. And so I just took his business card, Von Bon's business card, didn't look at it. And my son was diagnosed a few months later with autism. I looked at the card and it was Eric Fombon, who happens to be one of the world's leading experts on autism, especially on the epidemiology of autism, the prevalence of autism. Anyway, that's just an aside. This is another study from a year later, 2013. And this was a very interesting finding. I think I mentioned it briefly, tangentially earlier. Researchers reported that bilingual Spanish-English children with autism were more likely to use communicative gesture, as are typical bilingual children, than monolingual peers. In other words, bilingual children who without autism tend to use more communicative gestures than non-autistic. Than the non-autistic and the monolingual peers, rather, the monolingual peers. So the monolingual non-autistic are poor at using gestures, but autistic and bilingual both are better. And they also scored high on the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Composite Assessment, which assesses an individual's daily function and living skills. This suggests that rather than hindering communication and cognitive development, bilingualism enhances these abilities in children with autism, as it can in typically developing children. It's a general benefit for children, whether they're autistic or not. This was a paper, 2017. In fact, there have been two very exciting studies out of Canada. The first, led by Grace Yarocci in British Columbia, 2017, focused on parental reports of functional communication and executive function, which are part of the broader communication repertoire for children with ASD, who use a variety of means to communicate. And there's growing evidence to suggest that being bilingual enhances executive functions. And executive functions also include cognitive flexibility, referred to as set shifting. I think some of the previous talks in this series have been talking about a bit about changing set, changing activities. And the improvement in executive function is believed to happen because using two languages means that a person has to switch between mental modes smoothly and quickly. And over time, with practice, this switching of linguistic systems may limber up overall cognitive performance. So children with autism who tend to find it harder to switch gears when changing tasks find it less difficult if they are bilingual. That's what this study found. This is the other study from Canada, from McGill University in Montreal, also investigated executive function and found that children with autism may find it easier switching between tasks if they learn a second language, as the first study did. And it published in the journal Child Development, and the study found new reasons to believe that autistic children who are bilingual have increased cognitive flexibility compared to children who are monolingual. So Professor Aparna Nadig, who was a senior author of the paper, and her colleagues at McGill compared 40 children between the ages of 6 and 9, with or without autism, and bilingual or monolingual, and focused on computer-generated tests. And in sorting objects on a screen, these researchers found that bilingual children with autism performed significantly better when it came to the more complex part of the task shifting test relative to children with autism who were unilingual, who only spoke one language. And these findings may have an impact on how parents of children with autism teach their children. This study was relatively small, but the researchers believe that the implications of their findings are huge, and they plan to continue the study by following the children over the next 3 to 5 years to see how they develop. It's the first study to describe the language history and social experiences of a substantial sample of bilingual and multilingual autistic adults. This is from last year, so it's very recent. And it provided valuable insights on how these adults with autism can learn and use a new language, and how their bilingualism experiences shape their social life. Bilingualism changes the way people relate to others, and that's particularly interesting, of course, in a condition like autism, where social interaction presents many challenges for so many. Not all people with autism, but with a large proportion of them. So a better understanding of the overlap between the social variations of bilingualism and autism could unveil new ways to support the social experiences of autistic people. This is another paper from last year that found that, or findings suggest that adopting a more multilingual approach may have a positive impact on autistic children's communication with both immediate and extended family, and increase, as a byproduct, but a very healthy byproduct, increase parental well-being. By contrast, a more monolingual approach may engender negative consequences for wider family life, such as parental guilt or the prevention of siblings' bilingual development. And a paper from this year. Now, this was a fascinating paper, came out just a few months ago, and it drew attention to the unusual islets of ability, or splinter skills, which are associated with some people with autism, which can represent relative strengths in their development. And the paper highlighted, introduced the clinical case of an 11-year-old Russian boy with autism who, out of nowhere, spontaneously acquired the English language. Now, we find cases of this in the so-called autistic savant syndrome. People who have never played a musical instrument and have listened to music and then suddenly sit down at a piano and play it without having been taught. Quite extraordinary to watch. I've watched this happen. It's absolutely amazing to witness. But this boy learned English without being taught. We think it must have been because he was hearing broadcasts in English on television or radio. And while although the child demonstrated language deficits in both English and Russian, the discrepancy between the languages was paradoxical given the lack of exposure to English language. We don't know how really he got it. We think it must be media or some, obviously clearly heard it somewhere. It can't come out of nowhere at all, out of the vacuum. And the researchers hypothesized that such incidental second language acquisition in children with autism resulting from media exposure probably could become more frequent with the availability of the internet. Now, this is a study from this year. Very exciting study that examined whether bilingualism boosts theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other people have minds, understand other people's thoughts, that they have thoughts, which is can be impaired in autism. It's often measured by a non-verbal false belief or a verbal false belief task. This study actually used a non-verbal false belief task. The researchers assessed the children's belief reasoning alongside a series of other skills hypothesized to be beneficial for such reasoning, namely understanding, producing and thinking about language, recalling and switching between information and the severity of the autistic symptoms. And the overall results of this study emphasized the advantages for bilingual children with autism over their monolingual peers for grasping beliefs, and so therefore suggests that pursuing bilingualism may be beneficial for cognition in autism. Other boosts were also associated with bilingualism, such as recalling and switching between information, but these boosts were not directly related to belief understanding, highlighting the beneficial role of bilingualism per se. So although the study was actually initially designed to look at theory of mind impairment deficits in autism, it actually discovered as a byproduct other advantages of other benefits of being bilingual for an individual with autism. Here's one of the authors of that study, Stephanie Duhlmann, who's a researcher at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. And she said, as autism often affects language acquisition, bilingual families tend to give up on the use of one of the two languages so as not to exacerbate the learning process. However, it is now clear that far from causing autistic children difficulty, bilingualism can, on the contrary, help these children to overcome several aspects of their disorder, serving as a kind of natural therapy, which is a term I like, because education is the main form of therapy, in my view, over and above any kind of, certainly well over and above any kind of medicinal or any unproven scientific or biological approach, which can be dangerous sometimes, but that's not the theme of this talk. So the other co-author of that same study said, Eleni Peristeri, said bilingualism requires the child to work first on skills directly related to theory of mind. That is, he or she must be constantly be concerned with the knowledge of others. Does the person I'm talking to speak Greek or Albanian? In what language should I talk to him or her? And then in a second phase, the child uses his executive functions by focusing his attention on one language while inhibiting the second. And she, Elena, describes this as gymnastics for the brain, which acts precisely on the challenges linked to the autistic disorder. It's worth pointing out briefly that these findings from these studies of bilingual children with autism echo those from studies of bilingual children with other communicative disorders like specific language impairments. And similarly, researchers who study bilingual children with Down syndrome. It's also been shown that children with language impairments can use skills developed in one language to facilitate the learning of skills in another language. The studies I've cited above all involve situations which presuppose a strong support system in the native language. Because what happens if the individual with autism is raised in a subtractive bilingual environment, in other words, where the native language does not have a strong support system in the community? So in that situation, encouraging the native language would be beneficial for strengthening family relationships. But the child would need additional exposure either from school, from community programs, or the home to learn the language effectively. So some researchers in the field have suggested that in a subtractive bilingual environment, where the main, the native language does not have a strong support system in the community, it may be proved more beneficial to discourage bilingualism if the child will not be receiving the proper quality and amount of input fully to develop the additional language system. More language is needed in this particular area of study. It's very controversial, and my answer to this researcher is there should be sufficient support for that child in both languages. In a modern world in the 21st century, that child, that autistic child, should be able to find sufficient support. So a quick word, when I've mentioned that educational intervention, obviously educational intervention, that involves giving support, as I just said, in both languages for a bilingual child with autism. Of course, this costs more money, and you'll have people moaning, but that should be fought for. Parents should fight for that. We parents of autistic children have fought for improving over many decades. It was parents, remember, that fought off the refrigerator mother theory in the first time and got that generally removed from the from thinking. So Pena and his colleagues, 2007, stressed that in general, bilingual children with language disorders should be provided with bilingual intervention. Intervention in a child's primary language is most effective and transfers most readily. In order to maintain language gains, children must be exposed to language-rich environments that support the progress in intervention. And for bilingual children, this must include the home environment and daily routines in the main language, as well as in the school environments in the secondary language. Kenya and colleagues in 2009, a later study 2 years later, emphasized that children should have the opportunity to use both languages and that interventions should focus on language learning and meaningful use rather than production of correct surface forms. And in a study in 2015, at the University of Kentucky, Zainab Tay did a study of speech and language intervention on a school-aged child with autism and their family. She pointed out there was a widespread assumption, one I've talked about, that a second language would complicate the process and cause greater delays, but this study didn't show that. And in addition to the compelling cultural and social reasons to maintain a language disordered child's home language, the literature does not support the common assumption that learning two languages causes further linguistic delays or complications, either in typically developing children or in children with cognitive and/or linguistic disorders. Just a quick word about practical solutions. Well, first, they can be found in providing families with suitable information about autism and bilingualism. Increasing parents' understanding of autism could be important in reducing stigmatizing views. For example, research using short videos to teach non-autistic adults about autism was found to have a significant impact on reducing stigma, increasing knowledge of autism, and increased positive beliefs by one study earlier this year by Jones et al. Providing parents with accessible resources combining knowledge of autism with a review of current findings regarding bilingualism could ensure that recommendations from research reach the people who have a prominent role in the language experiences of their children. Second, researchers must ensure that information about language exposure does not focus solely on the cognitive effects of bilingualism, very important point this, but also on familial bonds, identity, community, and social inclusion. So within this, we cannot support an individual's cultural and linguistic identity without an understanding of their identity from their own perspective. It is crucial, absolutely essential, for children to feel involved when decisions are being made about and for them. And resources for families must also reflect the child's perspective. Currently, important questions remain about how autistic bilingual children feel about their language identity, feelings of inclusion with peers and within their cultural communities. Conducting research with children in this way will be an important step in creating a rigorous and complete evidence base for parents. So what are the clinical barriers to this, to improving the situation, to improving the education of bilingual children with autism and adults with autism? Research suggests that practitioners, including speech and language therapists, do not have confidence in the tools available to conduct diagnostic or language assessments with bilingual children. Although practitioners have a responsibility to maintain equality, while conducting assessments, many standardized tools existing are culturally inappropriate for children from culturally and linguistically diverse challenges. So, for example, the absence of eye contact and pointing behaviors are generally interpreted as autistic traits in most of the diagnostic tools. Yet in some non-Western cultures, for a child to exhibit these behaviors with adults is considered inappropriate or even impolite. As a result, children from culturally and linguistically diverse populations are commonly diagnosed later and are more likely to be misdiagnosed. Similarly, some intervention strategies are not culturally relevant for all children. Practitioners noted that for some families, parent-child interactions are less direct or do not take place on the floor. Children may be expected to display emotions differently, or the types of toys given to children to play with may not be typical in their culture. Importantly, the issues raised that I've just mentioned regarding assessment difficulties for linguistic children mirror findings from research focusing on other neurodevelopmental conditions, such as developmental language disorders. So adapting bilingual specific tools and practices would therefore benefit not only autistic children, but also children with other developmental conditions. I'm just going to conclude my talk with two rather delightful practical examples. This is Paula Benfeld-Diaz with her husband Cesar and their dual language autistic daughter. They haven't named her to preserve the daughter's anonymity and privacy. These are two upbeat stories, which is why I want to end my presentation with them. So she moved, Paula moved to the United States 4 years ago with her husband Cesar and their dual language autistic daughter. At the time, their daughter spoke only a few words of Spanish. They put her in a regular monolingual preschool and she added some English words to a limited vocabulary. They didn't know why she wasn't speaking, but both Paula and Cesar, the parents, are bilingual, and they both knew they wanted their children to be bilingual and ideally multilingual. And when their daughter was diagnosed a few months later with autism, as well as sensory processing disorder and a motor processing disorder, which makes motor planning in general and language difficult for her, the pediatrician in the United States suggested that they should speak to her only in English. Thankfully, I would say, ignored his recommendations completely, and they say that was the best decision they ever made. Their daughter is now doing grade level work in her first grade classroom with supports, accommodations, and assistive technology, and she speaks both English and Spanish. Her language development is certainly behind that of her peers, and sometimes it's hard to understand her in both languages, but she does speak both, and she prefers to use English, but at home the family speaks Spanish, and she not only understands it, but is expected, encouraged, and motivated to speak only Spanish to communicate at home. Paula says, I have met so many mums at conferences and speech therapists waiting rooms who speak a language other than English at home, but followed advice to speak to their children, followed advice to speak to their child only in English because that person, many of them therapists or teachers or doctors, thought that their degree gave them the ability to know what is better for a child without taking into account their culture. This is a problem, this conflict between the professionals and parents, which has existed for decades in the field of autism, but is getting a lot better because the professionals are getting a lot better. But the parents know their child best. Unless, as in the case of my son Johnny, they're in an absolutely magnificent educational placement for adults, which is residential, and so the child, in my case, an adult son with autism, it spends more time there, and so they are remarkably knowledgeable about Johnny, about his needs, about his abilities, about his strengths, about his challenges, and they're familiar, and he's familiar with them, and they're familiar with him. So I see many of these parents, says Paula, struggling to communicate with their child in broken English and then turning around and having a conversation between themselves or with a sibling in their home language, and it breaks my heart. These parents were advised to speak only English to their children with autism, regardless of the parents' proficiency in English. We are lucky in our family where you all speak English fluently, but that is not the case for most immigrant families. For these families speaking two languages, is a necessity, not a choice. In many cases, taking away a child's home language means that that child's communication with his family will be limited. The consequences of this are endless. Limited exposure to language, exposure to English that is used incorrectly, a breakdown in the child's relationship with his parents, siblings, and extended family, fewer opportunities for learning about social interactions, fewer opportunities to participate in community and family events, and the list goes on and on. Paula adds, I do not have a degree in medicine or speech language pathology, but I know we made the right decision. My daughter wants to be included and wants to participate and be treated like everyone else, both at home and at school. So if everyone in my home speaks Spanish, she wants to speak it too. She'll sometimes ask to watch her favorite movies in Spanish instead of English. And I have a feeling she does it because she's trying to improve her Spanish. You see, even though she speaks both languages, Spanish is a lot harder for her because Spanish words are longer. Sentences have more words, and pronunciation of some words is harder for her physically, both in the complexity of the mouth and tongue movements required, and because of the larger amount of motor planning involved in speaking a language that simply requires more sounds to say one word. For example, necesito is a longer and more complicated word than need. My little girl loves talking on Skype with her grandparents who live in Guatemala and telling them about her trips to the beach or her day at school. This is Paula speaking. Being bilingual boosts her self-esteem. That's another very important point. Self-esteem tends to be very low in autism. Anything that will boost an autistic individual's self-esteem is very important. Speaking English is part of who she is. It's part of her identity. She knows that other children at school speak only English, and she loves pointing out people who are speaking in Spanish when she hears them at the grocery store or the library. My daughter lives in a bilingual world, and stripping her of one of the two languages that make up this world would be to rob her of half her opportunity to communicate, socialize, express herself, and learn. And finally, and that's a wonderful example of what bilingual has brought, the positive effect. And the other, this wonderful photo of Eugene Ryan with his autistic son, Tida. Eugene is a university teacher in Japan and a researcher studying the effects of bilingualism on the linguistic and cognitive development of children with autism. So he knows a lot about in the field. And his son, this lovely little boy, Tida, also happens to be bilingual and autistic. Eugene and his wife are both fluently bilingual and speak English at home as a first language. Tida was diagnosed in Japan as being mildly autistic in April 2012. His age compared to his peers, but thought this was probably due to the bilingual setting at home. According to Eugene, Tida does not share many of the symptoms of classic autism. He's cheerful, tactile, and sociable. Well, actually, my son is cheerful, tactile, and sociable. So I think Eugene is being oversimplistic there. But anyway, the point is that allayed their concerns until the diagnosis of autism actually came through. Eugene says, all of a sudden, we found ourselves at a crossroads with some major decisions to make. We learned something of how intense daily life can be for someone with an autism spectrum disorder, and consequently, how hard it can be, in some cases, to develop language. For a time, it seemed to us something like common sense to think that living as we do in Japan, we may need to sacrifice his English in order to give him a fighting chance with his Japanese. We also felt as if we were facing this challenge all alone. It turned out that we were wrong on both counts. When our son began mixing his languages, I was worried that this fear was being borne out. And I've since learned, however, that code switching is a natural and healthy part of bilingual development. My research colleague has been conducting a study of a trilingual boy with autism, who's happily developing in all three languages, often switching between them mid-sentence. Our boy is now 7, and while he has his ups and downs, he is happily developing both of his languages. Our experiences has encouraged me to try to share with other parents the understanding that children on the autism spectrum can flourish in many languages. Since autism has such a range of severity and symptoms, maintaining or achieving multilingualism is probably not a realistic goal in all cases, says Eugene. The key point is that if any child shows a capability to learn one language, it means that they have the capacity to learn more than one. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Very interesting and excellent examples. Very, very personal, very nice. Thank you so much. So, hopefully there will be some questions and comments to break the ice. I'll read out loud a comment, if I can find it, by Nick Rosenthal, which reads as follows. Just to support where Adam is heading with this, for many children, speaking a second language is not a choice. If their family only speak language A at home, but they attend school or have friends who speak language B, then speaking the two languages is essential, such as speaking Spanish or Urdu at home and English at school with friends. So clearly a comment that goes in line with what you have been telling us, right?
I totally agree. No, that's absolutely well said, Nick. I can't say it better. Very well done. Very well said. Yes. Yes. Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, there's another one. It's more of a question.
Yes.
So Michelle Stern-Weber asks the following questions. She's interested in knowing about the impact of different syntax and morphology on language acquisition in the two languages.
Yes.
She's also interested to understand the research that involves nonverbal children. How do we know the impact benefits of two languages? Of course, not an easy question.
No, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Michelle. Well, first of all, very interesting about the syntax and morphology. There are lots, as I said before in my presentation, there are some linguists, very successful linguists with autism. I mentioned Daniel Tammet. There are others who with autism and Asperger's syndrome who are incredibly good at learning languages. I mean, they can learn a number 10 or more. I've met some, but they have a problem, in my experience. They're very good at learning, memorizing vocabulary. They can learn vocabulary in no time. What they have problem is with grammar. Now, this fits the neuropsychological profile of autism, or one of the neuropsychological profiles of autism, because autism is so complex and heterogeneous that you cannot name one. But one of the main ones is what's called weak central coherence. Weak central coherence means that a person with autism cannot see the overall picture. They're very good at seeing a detail. And in fact, there's a task called the embedded picture task, where they can see a triangle. They can see a number of triangles in a picture much better than non-autistic children can, but they can't see the overall picture of a pram. They can't see what the overall drawing is. It's a bit like not being able to see the wood for the trees. That's very, very strong. I prefer to see it as a strength in some way, but I prefer to use the term local processing bias. But when we look at language, when we look at syntax and grammar, it makes sense that people with autism who learn a foreign language tend to be able to remember individual words better, but not be able to put them together in a sentence, because the overall sense of a structure, the grammatical sense, doesn't make as much sense, because you have to know the context of the overall. You have to see the forest, you have to see the wood, and the trees are the words. So that's a very good question, very interesting point, and that's brought up a very interesting example of how learning languages, actually foreign language, does differ. The profile of language learning does differ in children with autism and adults with autism. I'm also interested in understanding the research involving non-verbal children. Yes, exactly. Now, well, by definition, this is a difficult one. Of course, non-verbal children do not speak any languages. So, in general, most research, sadly, in autism, involves verbal children, even if it's minimally verbal. Although we are finding more and more non-verbal children who are good at using their iPad to play games. And sometimes they can recognize words, they can read words and link it to the sound of a word. But there are very, very few non-verbal studies, if any, so far. That's what I would like to talk to my friend Professor Simon Barron-Cohen at the University of Cambridge, who runs the Autism Research Centre. I would like to talk to him more about conducting the first non-verbal studies on bilingual. That would be a fascinating study. I would love to, as a linguist myself, I would love to be involved in that. And but there are obviously some procedural problems with that. You have to be a very inventive use of an iPad, I think, or to use. The problem is with these controversial cases of people, non-verbal children with autism, or adults who start to speak, or not speak, sorry, who start to use a computer keyboard using this very, 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 very questionable method called facilitated communication. I don't know whether this has come up in previous bilingual talks in this series. This is questionable. It's questionable whether they can do it in the first place, and it's also questionable whether the adult or the carer is somehow prompting this person to type the letters. But you know, there have been cases where non-verbal autism, where they sat down on a computer and started to type very questionable. But if these can be proven scientifically to be effective, if any of these cases can be proven to be valid, then that would be an interesting subject for this these first non-verbal studies. But that's so anyway. Thank you very much, Michelle, for those two really interesting and valuable questions.
Thank you, Adam. Cristobal Gutierrez Torrubia from Spain thanks you for the presentation and stresses the fact that these topics are very important. So it's really good that we are drawing attention to that. So we want to thank you more generally, Adam Feinstein, for that. And he asked one or two questions, and I'll read. Is there any kind of evidence towards thinking that ASD children may mimic, quote, quote, the same the same problems when they learn L1 skills and later in the L2 skills, of course, assuming sequential bilingualism or a bilingual sequential bilingual context, sorry? Or could we have a scenario in which a neurodivergent child may find difficulties in learning in different areas in one language compared to the other?
Muchas gracias, Cristóbal, por esa pregunta tan interesante, tan fascinante, tan provechosa. No, it's I don't know what percentage of people speaking. I better speak English rather than reply in Spanish. But that's really important. Of course, everyone learning one language, or many people, have this problem that they may be confused when they tackle another foreign language. It happens. In my experience, the large proportion of typically developing non-autistic people find it easier to learn another language if they already speak one foreign language. It helps them. Or and all the studies so far show that if you speak one language well, or you speak grammatically correctly, then you learn a second language. You won't make the same problems. You won't make the same problems. And if you in other words, the strengths in that language, that first language, or the strength in the second language, will help you, will promote learning in a third language. Of course, if you have problems with your first language, speaking a first language, I think you are going to have problems, learning a second language. I think by definition, like as in the case of Paula in the first, the bilingual English-Spanish girl I gave in my practical example. I think it's more usual that when a person starts speaking one language with language problems, then starts speaking another one, that there are the same problems or similar problems. That would make sense because it's probably a neurological issue or a pragmatic issue where they're having problems understanding the context. So I would say that in general, and the studies seem to bear this out, that the problems aren't different in the different areas in the one language, first language to the second. But again, there needs to be more studies on this. As I say, there are very few, even though I've quoted most of them in my paper. I tried to quote as many as I could in the time. These are almost all, the ones I quoted are almost all the studies out there. There are very few, and they should be doing more, because actually, in terms of the practical use and making our main criteria, or our main criterion, I should say, to speak English correctly, our main criterion as researchers is to improve quality of life in people on the autism spectrum. That should be our main criteria. I believe these studies can help. I believe that, as we've shown, that the opposite is true, that if you take away one of the languages by telling the parents, don't use this, the language they're speaking at home because it's not the main language that you're living in, that can be disastrous in some cases. That can be a dramatic deterioration of the quality of life of that person. So these studies need to be widely circulated amongst educators, amongst professionals, amongst everyone working with autistic children, because otherwise there are going to be a lot of people out there with the increase in bilingualism and multilingualism. We are going to damage these people's potential, these children's potential for having a full quality of life where their potential is fulfilled. That's what I want to make that point. That's a very important point. These are not, esoteric academic studies. They are aimed at improving quality of life of people on the autism spectrum. And I'm hoping that they will do. And I'm hoping that some people who've heard this paper today or seeing it online, or this presentation will go back, talk to people who they know with autism, or maybe some of you have family members with autism, and it will be useful to spread the word in society that this is a vital part of improving life for so many people on the spectrum.
Thank you, Adam. I completely agree. And that's actually one of the main goals of this series, right? To try to reach out to people. And this topic in particular is of paramount importance in that regard. It's generating many questions. And one of them comes from Camila Vega. As usual, I'll quote, "I have a 7-year-old boy. We live in Brazil and he only speaks English. I'm an English teacher, but never taught him. He learned on his own. The thing is that he refuses to speak Portuguese, which has been a bit challenging with school since, for instance, most of his peers, most of his friends speak only Portuguese. Is there any kind of research on why that might be, why he chooses to speak another language?"
Well, autistic children can be very stubborn. If they like something, when my son was speaking language, he was using language before he lost it. My son was starting to speak, something I should have mentioned. And then he regressed and lost all his language. But he wasn't using it in a social way. He was using language autistically, as I now know. Autistically in quotes. He wasn't using it to share attention. He was using it to get pleasure almost out of using it. Personal pleasure, personal joy. He was labeling objects. There was a kind of joy in being able to label an object. So he would say, when we point to a cup, and he'd say cup. Point to an apple, he would say apple. Extraordinary, really. I mean, his vocabulary in English was bigger than it was wider and earlier than his two elder sisters. So extraordinary. But the point I'm trying to make is the pleasure he had in using language. Now, sometimes you want to, in a bilingual situation like this question, a very good question, in Brazil, you want them to be bilingual. You want them to speak the main language, the language of the country. But they for some reason, they get joy out of speaking the other language. Unfortunately, that pleasure is very strong, and I would not want you to drive that out, do anything to risk them speaking that language. That's the trouble. So my advice is to read. There are things I'm sure Camila is doing, like speaking in Portuguese, like reading to him in Portuguese. I'm sure they're doing this, like going to playgroups, like watching films on telly in Portuguese. I'm sure this is all happening. The trouble is, he's got a kind of selective mutism in one language. There is a condition called selective mutism where autistic children do not speak in certain conditions, in certain contexts. They'll only speak in one place and they'll be silent in another. It's an extraordinary condition. I've seen it. They will speak at home, but not at school. They'll go completely mute. It sounds as though this is a variation of selective mutism. There is no one treatment for this except to smile, to be very patient, to keep giving him, submerge him in the second language. Well, it's your first language, but in the second language for the country in Brazil. Sorry, it's the first language in Brazil, but the second language at home. So presumably, if you're coming as an English teacher, and he learned that. I mean, first of all, the question is, it's extraordinary how he learned it. I mean, that is the thing. I mean, when I look at the question, Camilla is an English teacher, but never taught his son, and yet he found the joy in that language. I mean, as a linguist, I find that very moving. That anybody, non-autistic, autistic, finds pleasure in learning a language. I can't knock that or try and suppress that instinct. I want that to go on. But I totally understand what Camilla says, that it's not very useful in a country which speaks Portuguese. But of course, surely the language he must be being exposed to is Portuguese at home, in terms of the media, in terms of books, because all the media, all the Brazilian media is in Portuguese. I mean, so you're going to have to keep trying, Camilla, keep putting it on. Is there anything he likes watching? That's my question would be, is there anything he likes watching, a particular film, a particular cartoon that he likes watching in English? Maybe there is an English language thing he's watching, or an English language book you've given him that he can watch in a Portuguese translation, in a Portuguese version, try and transfer some of the skills over, or some of the listening, the exposure over to Portuguese, because that's the only way. There's no magic solution to this one. It's a very interesting problem, which I haven't heard that often. Normally it's the language at home is the one, as I've said, is the one that's been spoken most, and the authorities or the professionals have been trying to drum that out. But this is the other way around. So you know what? I'm going to. I would love to stay in touch with Camilla, because actually I'd like to, if that's possible. Can she put her email address in the chat? Because I need to find out whether there are any studies on this, because it's such an unusual case, whether it's the other way around. I would love to. There we are. That's the one. I'll take that down, and I must keep in touch. And if I can find some studies, or get in touch with people who are doing it, it's so often the reverse situation that I must find out. Fascinating question, Camilla. Thank you so much. Yeah, as she says, Camilla, we're doing all of that. Yeah, the boy has a will of iron. As I said, yeah, it's very hard, because there's a kind of inflexibility of thought, which is a strength. It's a strength in the workplace for people with autism, because their attention to detail but these their skills with autism can have a double edge. It's a double-edged sword. So the inflexibility, the inability or difficulty with changing sets or changing activities is also associated with a strength, which is ability to focus on a task, ability to focus on detail, which is why they're so good at so many people with autism are good at IT, or with working with computers. So good luck, Camilla, is all I can say. And I will keep in touch with you, because I want to see if I can find a study. Any other questions, Julio?
Yeah, there is a very nice question as well from Elizabeth Tobin. She thanks you for the fascinating presentation, and the question is the following. Yes. Are there any studies on the acquisition of pragmatic competence in bilingual children on the autism spectrum? Could a child be more pragmatically competent in another language, or do you think that the pragmatic competence would be reflected in the L2? Just to clarify to people, by pragmatics we mean meaning in context, right? Exactly. Using language in real situations.
Exactly. Yeah, I did mention that in my talk. Yeah, exactly. But that's right. Yes, the studies show, some of the studies I mentioned with improvement in executive function also applies to using language more appropriately in context. The bilingual children with autism, in a number of studies, have been shown to use language more pragmatically, more appropriately, more in context than monolingual children. It's because I think it's the brain processes in having to switch tasks, having to think about how that second language works. You do. I mean, when any of us learn a second language, we have to learn, unless we do it instinctively, unless we have to learn when to use a certain word. Some words are very inappropriate in certain contexts, like swear words. Some swear words are much stronger in one language than in the other. And we find that in these bilingual children with autism, in general, yes, they are better. They pick up, they gain pragmatic competence in the second language. And actually that feeds back to the first language, it's a bidirectional process, which is fascinating. And that's another great question. And it's so good to see. We're talking about benefits. And I am I'm a natural optimist. I'm not a naturally positive person. And I do feel that bilingualism, I do not like the negative approach to bilingualism, which for decades has been the norm the people on this working in the autism field. And I really am trying. I'm hoping this has helped to fight against it, and also the general picture of the model of the deficit-based model of autism, which still pertains in some parts of the world. You know what? And I think we should always be concentrating and focusing on what people with autism can do, not what they cannot. So to turn to a parent and say, yes, he's speaking that second language really well, but I don't think you should be encouraging it. It's just a message which is anathema to me. It really stinks, basically, to put it in strong terms. It really does it to turn to a parent and say, you've got to eliminate that skill. And a person with autism makes no sense, and all the research shows it now makes no sense. So let's keep going. Let's fight. If there are any parents, or there are parents in the audience, I'm glad to say, keep fighting. Not just in bilingual cases of bilingualism, but in general, for better facilities for people to show motivation. Motivation is so key. I just want to, and I know we're running short of time, but motivation is so important in increasing self-esteem, in finding a job for people on the autism spectrum. But of course, as I said before, speaking a second language increases self-esteem. It does in any of us. You know, I speak a few languages, and it gives me joy speaking. It gives me joy. It gives me joy. It gives me pleasure. Self-esteem is for parents out there with the children on the spectrum. Do not fight these special interests, and that includes languages. Don't call them obsessions. I do not like the term obsession. Obsession has negative connotations. They do not use them. Do not use that term. Exploit all the special interests of your child with autism. And if that includes a second or third level, fourth or fifth language, go for it. Go for it. Full speed ahead, because it will be beneficial. I promise. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Adam. That's great. I don't see any more questions about the topic per se, and everybody thanks you very, very enthusiastically. But you know, since you just mentioned the languages you speak, and not moving away necessarily from autism, but you know, in the broader context of multilingualism, which is what the cycle is about, would like to hear briefly, before we adjourn the meeting, about your own experience with bilingualism, your journey to become a multilingual. If you want to share some thoughts. We all know you because obviously you're famous, you're an acclaimed translator, writer, etc. But we want to hear about your personal experience with languages.
Yes, you know, well, growing up in Cambridge, you know, my mother was a famous writer, Adam Feinstein. My father was a scientist. I was brought up in a bohemian household, a chaotic household with books everywhere, with lots of poets from all languages coming in and speaking languages. And I was hopeless at maths. I was hopeless at mathematics, and I still am. I still am. But I loved languages. I don't know where it came from. I suppose it was partly the exposure at home. I'm also a pianist. I think there's a big connection between music and language. I think they often, I think we believe they use the same part of the brain. And so I used to teach myself languages. I learned Spanish actually I taught myself by hitchhiking around Spain, 1975. That was the last year of Franco's life. He was attached to tubes in hospital, and the point was that all the drivers who picked me up, you can't hitchhike around Spain now; it's far too dangerous. But in those days, you could. It was wonderful. I got all the way around Spain. I even went over to meet Robert Graves in Mallorca. That was fascinating. And the point is that the drivers spoke no English at all, so I had to speak Spanish. So I just muddled through. The good thing about Spain is they don't care. They don't care. It's not like, dare I say it, some parts of France where you have to speak immaculately, perhaps, for them to open up and speak speak back to you in French. Maybe I'm generalizing, I'm sorry, but I would say that the Spanish are very good they're very happy for you to speak whatever Spanish you've got. and they would talk it through, and you'll have a conversation. I was also reading magazines which no longer exist. Blanco y Negro in Triunfo. These are historic relics. I probably got somewhere in my house some copies. And what I was doing was underlining every word I didn't know and looking up in the dictionary. This was before the days of word reference, of course, long before. So I had a big Spanish dictionary, a huge Castle's, I think it was Castle's or Oxford, looking up every word I didn't know. So I had a great patience for languages because I loved them so much. I just had a fascination for language, and I even wrote some poems in another language. I remember in Spanish, very young. So that was what. So if you're interested, we're talking about motivation again. Back to my point about motivation. My motivation was language. I also loved speaking to people. You know, some people with autism learn languages for the joy of learning them. This is another point I think relates back to something one of the questioners put a question put to me. They're not that interested in using it pragmatically in terms of using it with other people. They love the joy of learning, acquiring another language, but actually it turns out they don't actually use it with anybody. That's extraordinary, but that fits the autistic profile. It's a kind of, it's an intellectual obsession. Oh, I did it myself. I used obsession. I broke my own rule, intellectual special interest, to correct myself. And they don't use it pragmatically or practically to communicate with others. It's an extraordinary thing. I would not like that. Well, I'm not autistic. As far as I know, I don't have many. In fact, I became a journalist because I like the fact that every day is very different. You know, one day you're interviewing Nelson Mandela, as I was, and next minute I was interviewing a teacher or something. So it's fascinating. But I learned languages to be able to use them. So as soon as I was on the tube or I hear someone speaking one of my languages, I immediately open up. I'm not particularly shy either. I'm not really shy in the slightest. So I like communicating with people. I like talking to strangers. And so I would learn to use it. And of course, the more you learn a language, the better you get. Like learning the piano. So that was how I did it. Then, of course, Pablo Neruda came along, and there was no biography in English that was worthwhile. So my agent at the time got me, got me to go to Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury took it on, and then I was traveling a lot. That got me to travel around the world because Neruda was un viajero inmóvil. Because he traveled around the world, but everywhere he traveled, he missed his hometown, Chile. So he was immobile in that sense. And I traveled around the world to all the countries he went to, all around Latin America, and that meant I learned the different forms of the language. And then it comes back to pragmatism. So of course, a person with autism who learns Argentinian Spanish is going to have to learn a different kind of pragmatic vocabulary to speak to a person in Mexico, things like that. So it's been fun. It's been fun learning languages, and our translation has been hugely enjoyable. It's doing translation for anyone who translates out there. If you translate a poem and it works well, it's like the feeling of solving a crossword puzzle. You've achieved you've solved a challenge. But more than that, for instance, in my latest book of rhyming translations of Rubén Darío, I preserved the rhyme in the English, because not only did Darío say "cada palabra tiene un alma," every word has a soul, but actually you can't understand Darío's poetry if you don't preserve the rhyme, because the meaning lies in the rhyme or the rhythm or the sound or the music. Mostly there's musicality. So I love the musicality of language, which goes back to my playing the piano. All these things fed into each other. A funny thing is, my father was an immunologist. If he'd been alive, he would have been fascinated with the COVID pandemic. But when I was growing up in Cambridge, I didn't have any interest in science at all. I went to his lab outside Cambridge at Bay Birmingham. I just found these whirling centrifuges completely meaningless and boring. But then when my son was diagnosed with autism, I suddenly became really fascinated with autism, with the science, autism-related science, genetics, neurology, neuroscience, and I could speak to my father. And so now, you know, I write chapters. Unbelievably, I think my father would not believe this. I mean, he would not be. He would be laughing, chuckling in disbelief if he saw that I'm writing papers on linguistics of autism and the neuroscience of autism. He would say, "What? Is that my son Adam? You know, what is going on here? That can't be him." The man who was bored stiff, the boy who was bored stiff. And so I do have these two or various fields of, you know, autism and Spanish translation and film as well. I have, because I have the opposite from autism, the profile. I cannot focus on one thing at a time. I'm absolutely impossible. I need 10 projects on the go at the same time. I remember my mother, the writer Elaine, she said, "You're spreading yourself too thin." And I said, "Well, that's better than spreading myself too fat," is what I said. It was a frivolous response, but what I meant was I cannot concentrate on one in the way that autistic people can, and which is their strength. So anyway, I've said too much in that answer. I'm sorry, I went on, but that's the answer. Okay, well, thank you for that question, Julio.
Thank you, Adam. It's been wonderful. I know we're running out of time and it's getting very late here for everyone. Well, really, thank you, Adam Feinstein. It's been an amazing pleasure, and the whole thing has been fascinating, to be honest. And this last journey, you know, a nice journey in bilingualism, multilingualism, has been delightful as well. So, well, I don't think we have any final questions. So I will just thank you and repeat to you that people are thanking you very enthusiastically in the chat. We still have another.
Thank you so much. Could I say, yes, could I say thank you for so many people coming? Thank you so much for so many people coming. Thank you so much for the interesting questions. You know, you never know what questions you're going to get. And they were all right to the point and bang on. Thank you so much for everybody coming. Thank you for the Instituto Cervantes for inviting me. Thank you, Julio, for chairing it so well.
Lovely.
And are there any other? I think have come in. Oh, they're just saying fascinating talk, which is so kind.
Very enthusiastic praise in the chat.
I'm glad. Look, we all need, by the way, just to finish, going back to self-esteem, you know, the people with autism, for those of you who are parents of autistic children, heap praise on them, even if they are non-verbal, like my son. They can understand a lot, so they have receptive language, even if they don't have expressive language. So heap praise on them verbally. Tell them whenever they do anything, the smallest step, make them feel it's a huge step, because it is a huge step. Say, "Well done, well done." Smile at them, pat them on the back, do whatever you can to make sure, even if they speak no language, whatever level of autism they have, whatever severity, make sure they know that they are doing something right, that they are loved, and that they are doing the right thing, because their self-esteem will go up. They will go up. I have a case in my book, Autism Works, about employment, of a girl. It's a wonderful example. Angela, non-verbal autistic. She works without being paid at a farm in the south of England called the Littlegate Farm. She works on the farm, but it's not exploitation, because she also works as a cook in an Italian restaurant, and she gets paid a living wage, a proper wage. She's non-verbal autistic. She doesn't speak a word, but she gets paid. She gets a pay slip for cooking, especially cooking the best tiramisu in the south of England. That's not just me who says that. Everyone says that about our tiramisu. They are famous throughout that part of London, that part of England, the south of England. And so I have a lovely photo of her in my book, of Angela with her first payslip, beaming with joy, because she somehow knows she's done something valuable for society. She has no language. She's autistic. Please remember that there are people out there who are giving up, who are tempted to give up on your child with autism because they have no language. No, don't do it. They can. There are possibilities out there, and their self-esteem. You find the motivation, find what they're good at, find what interests them, and use it for practical effect. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Adam. Es
Nada.
maravilloso escucharte con tanto entusiasmo. Por favor, please stay tuned for the next talk next month by Maria del Carmen Parafita Couto, who is present here. And well, that will close the cycle for this year. Thank you, everyone. Gracias, Adam. Thanks to the Instituto, and see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.